interesting places in the world if you've never been there. At least in the academic world. An MA in sociology from Washington State, and a PhD in sociology from the University of Oregon. Her research interests include climate change denial, the intersections of environmental health, race, gender, and gender with environment, and the sociology of emotions, countries and culture, across countries and cultures. The titles of her publications run a real gamut, which shows a very active mind. And the titles alone make for highly engaging reading. The topic for today's talk is emotions and climate discourse in the construction of climate denial. Please join me in welcoming Kari Norgaard.
Thank you so much, Michael, and to Chuck for organizing, and it's really an honor to be here. And I didn't check, but this presumably is my forward. And does the mic actually work, or do it? Yeah. It does. Okay. Sure. And people prefer that I use it. I'll try to be contained here. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor. There's obviously a lot of exciting momentum that is happening here, and I'm delighted to get to share with you a little bit of some of the things that I've been thinking about for quite a while now in terms of climate change. Obviously, incredibly important problem for our world in many different ways at many different levels. So the image here is actually from the cover of my book, Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life. As you can see, I think it is an image of people skiing on 100% artificial snow, which is, this image isn't actually from the town where I did my ethnographic work in Norway, but it is what happened there. It just happened to be a better picture than the ones I took. And so I'll be speaking today starting with giving some of the basic ideas of the book, which is intended to try to change a discourse around climate change. And then I want to give some follow-up, something I've been doing since it's come out, and so forth. So I'm a sociologist, as you well know, and many people may not know that well what sociologists do. My undergraduate and background was in biology. I've had a long-term interest in thinking about relationships between humans and the natural world, and have been part of interdisciplinary context pretty much ever since. And a lot of you may not necessarily be as familiar with what sociologists per se would have to say around climate change. Hopefully that will become very clear after our time together. But also how sociology fits with other disciplines, such as economics, psychology, geography, other social science disciplines. So I'll hope to try to orient you a little bit in this larger disciplinary way as I proceed. So as you're well aware, there has been for quite some time now, thankfully, an interdisciplinary conversation on this important issue of climate change. And this is a problem that disciplines are artificial entities, and we need to think together from many different frameworks to build knowledge to try to respond to the many complex questions. And many of you have been involved with this work yourselves for decades, and I thank you for it. And when we look at what's been happening, however, there's been better work done, very good work done, and better work done from more of the natural and physical science side of things. And there has been less work done from the social sciences and less of a job integrating them. And actually, there's a piece that I'll be drawing from I did a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education about a month and a half ago that speaks to this. So if you're interested in some of the things I have to say, you could look it up. Excuse me. So at the same time that we continue to need, obviously, urgently, there's many, many questions. We're not done with the natural science side of things. There has been much less work done from the social sciences. And this is something that I find very needs to change. And so it's in that sense as well that I really appreciate the invitation to come here and speak about it. And the piece that I have in the Chronicle is a little bit about that question, sort of as to why that is and how we may proceed beyond it. There's a lot of reasons, including biases on different sides of camps, different people's perceptions. Many of us in our disciplines, myself included, feel that where our discipline is most important, or have a hard time maybe understanding where people are coming from or how to go about integrating things. So my work that I'll talk about here, the work from Living in Denial and the thoughts that are going to come after it, grows out of this paradox that many people, that natural sciences first identified and that many social sciences are also interested in, which is that we have an incredible degree of consensus of understanding about how serious climate change is, and yet there's been the amount of social mobilization does not follow. How can this be? So James Hansen first testified on climate change in front of U.S. Congress in 1988. It was first a front page story in the New York Times around that time, and so on and so forth. This is a huge crisis. We know a fair amount about it, and yet there's not been here's, you're all familiar with the data about the trends and what this crisis means, and that there are very significant social consequences for it. Yet, when it comes to the public side, life just seems to go on. It is not reached, and this is changing a little bit. We have more media coverage, we have more political mobilization. It has changed a little bit, but really we are not on par in any Western democratic nation with the kind of response that we should have, considering how serious this issue is. And so there's a lot of work that's been done on this, and my book and a lot of my thinking has been trying to change the direction of this and add to this. A lot of the work that has been done has focused much more on an individuals. This is in part because we've done a better job incorporating economics and psychology into the larger interdisciplinary conversation than other disciplines like sociology, which is going to tend to talk about power structures and cultural practices. And in particular, when it comes to these kinds of conversations, there's not been much discussion of some of the things that I think are particularly important, such as how emotions shape political response and cultural practices, how culture itself matters, how all of this is embedded within political economy. So most of the approaches to this question, why aren't people responding, have either assumed some version of the fact that people just don't get it, and of course, and probably most of us in the room experience this, that the people around us do not get how serious of a crisis this is. It's not that that's not important, or that somehow people just don't care enough. The humans don't care enough about each other because Americans are very individualistic, we are inherently greedy, these kinds of things. It's not that these explanations are not important, but this is kind of where it stopped. And from my perspective, as a sociologist, climate change is posing an incredibly serious threat to our society, to our social order, at a very large level. And we can think about theoretically then what that means for as a larger question, in the same way that if there are people in the room who study species invasions or have colleagues that do this, part of why biologists study species invasions is to understand how systems are functioning. When you have a very large disturbance to a system, you can see things about how it functions. So partly I'm interested in climate change from this level too, because it is a very profound disruption to our economic systems, to our political systems, to our cultural practices, to our sense of meaning. And I believe, and I hope to convince you in the next 35 minutes or so, that climate change actually poses two very significant threats to democracy, one of which we've really identified more, and that has to do with the climate contrarian or climate skeptic movement, which has challenged the role of facts in society, has challenged, this is a basic idea from our democracy, that we will build a rational society based on facts, and that is being challenged through the climate skeptic or contrarian movement. And I think that's important, but I actually think the piece that that I'm focusing on in my work is equally, or maybe more important, but not as well understood, which has to do with how we can ignore facts, how we have the capacity as a collective, not just individually, to resist information that is very disturbing to our social order. And so I'm interested in denial, but it's not denial in the sense of the contrarian movement. It's denial in the sense of ignoring. And I draw on British sociologist Stanley Cohen, who categorizes there's literal denial, which is more the contrarian, it's not happening. Interpretive denial might be, well, it's not exactly what you think it is, we're going to give some spin to this process. I'm interested in, and we'll talk about implicatory denial, which is the idea, and this is a quote from Stanley Cohen, the fact of children starving to death in Somalia, a mass rape of women in Bosnia, a massacre in East Timor, homeless people on our streets are recognized, but are not seen as psychologically disturbing or as carrying a moral imperative to act. Unlike literal or interpretive denial, knowledge is not at issue, but doing the right thing with the knowledge. And here you can see the democratic, the implications for democracy. If we're going to have a democracy organized around all of the scientists gathering facts and telling us what's going on, we need to actually respond to that information, especially when there's such a serious crisis as climate change. So I want to hopefully make an argument, lay out an argument for you from my book that this is not inevitable. This is not this sort of ignoring or this misfit between the incredible body of scientific knowledge. I mentioned to Michael earlier, I took an entire course on climate change as an undergraduate student in 1989, an entire course. So there's a lot of information we've known for a long time. But that this misfit is not, it actually takes work to do, to ignore a problem that is out there to a certain extent circulating. And we can think of this in the way that there's a metaphor of the elephant in the room that people sort of have to carefully not step on, to pretend to ignore, to not refer to the fact that there's a large trunk or what have you. That metaphor is useful in the sense of thinking about this as an active process. It's not natural. I won't give you a ton of the theory that I'm going to develop this with, but essentially I'll draw on social psychology, but build also on theory from sociology of emotions. Sociologists think about emotions again in terms of how they operate in creating social order or social change, not just as something private that you or I might experience in a very individual sense, but really as part of how social order happens. I'll show you some examples of conversation analysis, thinking about social norms, and situate all of that in political economy, in the economic base of nations that affects these things. So, lots of lead up. I'm interested again then in this question of how and why people are resisting information on climate change. My work is set, the ethnographic portion of it, 8 months long. I won't give you a lot of methodology. It's set in Norway, a country that's interesting for a variety of reasons. No Norwegians in the room, no one that's fessing up. In any case, Norway is a wonderful place. It's my own heritage is part Norwegian, but also it's a country that's a lot of political awareness, high newspaper readership, high environmental consciousness, high degree of wealth, quality of life. A lot of the reasons that it becomes difficult to think about climate denial in the U.S. are mitigated there. So also, of course, it's farther north, so forth. So I spent 8 months in this town, well, 10 months in total, but 8 months really intensively doing ethnography, and then I followed up with a bunch of interviews. In this community of about 10,000 people that had a lake that failed to freeze, although it usually does. People ice fish there, but they couldn't. A woman fell through the ice walking because it hadn't frozen properly. There's also a ski area that provides a lot of significant winter tourism that was eventually able to open when they made some artificial snow at great expense. So I talk about these things, but even though all of these things were happening, climate change was not being constructed as a political problem. It was this sense of ignoring. Instead, I'll give you some quotes from people in a minute. Big to be is the name of this. It's just a Norwegian word. It actually is very clumsy in English, so I apologize for that. But it's just a town. It's a pseudonym for the town, and it means a place that's about that size. It's kind of between a city and a really small place. And so the possibility of climate change was both very disturbing to people when I spoke to them individually in interviews, and I'll give you some of those quotes, but as a collective was almost invisible. There were I spent time looking at the newspaper, going to all kinds of political meetings, social settings, all of these, as many spaces in society that this community as I could. And it wasn't something that people were talking about except in very, very specific ways. Instead, and these are some quotes from people, people had to sit themselves down and think about it. Didn't think about it in the everyday, but if they did, in between, climate change was this disturbing emotional weight. And so I draw on Robert Lifton's concept of the absurdity of the double life. He developed this thinking about what it means during the Cold War and the arms race, that we now had nuclear weapons that could, I don't know how many of you remember this, but all of the talk of the weapons can be coming over in 2 minutes to midnight, and that life could change very quickly at any moment. But for most people, even though they knew this, you don't live in that way. So I found this concept very useful for climate change, that there's knowledge that people have, but we live as though we don't, as though it's not true. I don't know if anyone in the room can relate to that. We can get to the discussion. I'll give you a few quotes. This one woman says, I get often afraid, like it goes very much up and down with how much I think about it. But if I sit myself down and think about it, how it could actually happen, how if this year continues, it could kind of have no difference between winter and spring and summer, like lots of stuff about the ice that's melting, there will be flooding. It's depressing the way I see it. Other people have spoken about waking up in the middle of the night, sort of gripped with fear around climate change, but then through the day we have our lives as though none of this is true. So through the course of interviews and so forth, I honed in on 3 emotions that were very important, that were very disturbing to people, and that people do not want to feel. Turns out we can do, we have a lot of choices about how we handle things we don't like to feel. A lot of addictive behaviors come out of this. Perhaps I'm not a psychologist, I'm not going to go down that road. But it's not just that we do things when we have these unpleasant situations. And in each of these cases, and this is where I draw on psychology and social psychology, for example, for the emotion of guilt, who here likes to feel guilt? It is also really in contrast to how people see themselves as individuals, as good people, and how Norwegians or Americans see themselves as good as a collective in terms of national identity. And social psychologists tell us that the theory of cognitive dissonance, extremely powerful theory, is difficult to hold 2 conflicting emotions in your mind at once, or 2 conflicting thoughts. And so there's this conflict there. So thinking about climate change makes you feel guilty. We don't want to feel guilty. We see ourselves as good, and so we don't think about climate change. But it's not quite as simple as that. It's actually, as I'll talk about, the process through which people don't think about it. Similarly, fear of the future. I have a 9-year-old child. Many of you probably also have children, grandchildren, young people in your lives. What does this mean? What do those graphs that I briefly showed from the IPCC mean for the future of this institution, of this state, of the people that we care about? The fear about the future is a very real thing, and turns out, social psychological theory around the idea that we have a need for ontological security, a need for a sense that life shall continue in some way. Similarly, the 3rd emotion I focus on is this sense of helplessness. So again, especially in these, I think about these in a political context as well, in the context of democracy, of not seeing strong leadership, or not seeing other people around you acting, engaging. We have a sense of needing to believe that we have control over our lives. And so as part of our identity and part of a sense of self-efficacy. So I want to give you a few quotes from people. One man, a very engaged local, worked in the community, like the city organizational level, We go on vacation, we go shopping, my partner drives to work every day. We feel we must do it to make things work on a practical level, but we have a guilty conscience, a bit of a guilty conscience. I did a number of focus groups in the United States after that initial work in Norway, so I have a chapter in the book that's on the United States as well, and interviews and other things, so I'll give you some quotes also from people in the US. This is from a young woman. I find there's a kind of guilt because the way we live culturally, the way we've been raised is so contrary to our ideals in a lot of ways. You can be against global warming to a certain extent, but we're still heating our homes and driving our cars and shipping our food long distances. It's really hard to live in a social context and be aligned with your beliefs on the environment. Second emotion, fear about the future. This is from another man in Norway, also who was quite active in the local community. We've come so far that we've begun to see that to protect or not protect the environment we are living in 100 years, it's possible the environment will be damaged to the point it isn't possible to live on Earth anymore, you know? And this is from a student. When I hear Bill McKibben speaking and they talk about the tipping point, fear comes in with the helplessness. Oh my God, there is nothing. I found out, you know, we're 50 years away from the worst. We haven't even felt the effect of what we're doing now. It makes me think we can't do anything. It's already beyond help. And there is the fear. You can see the links between these. And then the third one, I think there's a lot of people who feel that no matter what I do, I can't do anything about that anyway. And from an American, and again, notice sort of the political context of the second quote, that's like where I feel the most helpless. It's like I know all this stuff. I have all this information, but what the hell do I do with it? I don't know where to turn. I don't know who to talk to. Yeah, I can write my congressman a letter, but in all honesty, I'm not sure that one person can make such a difference. And so here, thinking about, again, the relationships to larger democracy and so forth. So again, I mentioned that we have these individual things. There's social psychological theory that indicates that we have a need to see ourselves in certain light, and that these emotions, when people experience them on the individual level, don't fly well. So this is a problem. Cognitive dissonance comes into play. But I want to think more now as a sociologist. Psychology tends to be more individualistic. Economics as well tends to think about people in the more individual sense. This is one of the things that is very important. I think about having a sociological presence in the interdisciplinary conversation on climate change is to understand the ways that what we do as people, as individuals, are influenced and shaped and by our social context, both in terms of our immediate community, our social norms, and in terms of our political, economic values, choices, and the rhetoric and the discourse, which is in the title of my talk, Climate Discourse. So sociology, sociological context matters for both why people feel those emotions and what they're going to do about them, as I'll elaborate in a minute. The helplessness is related to not trusting and not feeling that there's democratic action, not seeing other people around them picking up the torch and caring about climate change, make people feel more helpless, more fearful, and so on. So when I talk about the idea that this is not, we can think about denial as an individual, I want to think about it as a collective practice. And I'll give you a few kinds of examples. On the one hand, and I'm sure you experience this, you know, how we think, what I can think about, what you can think about, is a function of what each other thinks about. And this is partly the idea of a social, there are social bounds of how we can think. You know, we think about paradigms and paradigm shifts and these kinds of things. And part of this also has to do with what we think about the sociology of attention, also social norms of conversation. What's acceptable to talk about shapes how we construct meanings, shapes what we understand. What's acceptable to feel? Is it acceptable to, for me or any of us to show really strong emotions around climate change, even though we may feel them? And what difference does it make that it isn't, right? In terms of our understanding creation of political community or understanding how urgently this problem is. So in this context where there are different social norms, people fit themselves into these social norms. We have ways of modifying these motions that we feel. to the appropriate conditions. And in so doing, we create a certain reality, this double reality Robert Lifton is talking about. So one of these is selective attention. You don't want to dig yourself into depression, these are all quotes. You don't want to dig yourself into depression, right? Everybody knows that. So what do? You control your exposure to information. I don't know about you all, but I get very agitated when I listen to the news. I get very angry. I don't always agree with the perspectives of the newscasters. My husband will not listen to the news with me because I talk back, I get so upset. And also, I cannot start my day by listening to the news because then I can't focus on the thing I need to do. So I generally listen to the news in the afternoon and the evening when I've already accomplished the things I'm trying to do. So if there's something major that's happened in the world this morning, I don't know about it. But this is part of how I control my exposure to information in order to manage my emotions to get through my day, right? I just give it as an example. People also talk about just reading very little of details or having this knowledge and living in a different world. Another way that people do this is talking about controlling, we have a discussion of norms of time. There's the saying that indigenous people have thought about things 7 generations into the future, and isn't that wonderful because it helps them visualize and plan for it. This is an example of our construction and norms of time. However, quite the opposite was happening in this community around climate change and also around space. So norms of time and space can be constructed in order to make climate change or events that were happening not seem connected to climate change. This is an example that has to do with social inequality, but people talk about in terms of not thinking so far ahead, or this one woman who's an activist on human rights issues talked about, it's terrible to think that we live so well while others live in miserable conditions. Of course, it's very good to have a comfortable life. I enjoy it. But I feel so bad about the others, the guilt, unpleasant emotion. I have a guilty conscience, and that's why I try not to think about it, to keep it at a distance. So this is, again, this construction of space and time. Another way that people do this is more on the national level. And some of these discourses come from the US government, from the Norwegian government in this case. This idea of America, which I've spelled, actually I've misspelled it in the Norwegian way, which is kind of spelled, it should only have the K. People get a lot of mileage out of comparing themselves to Americans, turns out in Norway. A lot of us in this room may make ourselves feel better about complaining about the climate skeptics, climate contrarians. Oh, they're the real problem. Meanwhile, not focusing on the things that we ought to be doing about climate change, whether that's in terms of political engagement, research agendas, or getting on an airplane less often. People characterize, they have these larger discourses of, and also China, right? The real problem is them, not us. Norway is Norge er et lite land. Norway is just a little country. Actually, Norway is a pretty big player in the fossil fuel industry in terms of trying to get the language around human rights out of the Paris Agreement and some of these things that they do. But oh, it's just little Norway. And this postcard that I found is also this sort of characterization of Norwegians as simple people who are connected to, there's a wonderful Norwegian sociologist, Thomas Hilland Eriksson, has written a lot about this. This construction of Norway as this rural life and so on and so forth, which has sort of services for people in terms of these other issues. Also, there are kinds of discourses that are about, they are ways of justifying things. What Robert Lifton called claims to virtue. He uses that phrase in development with how the ways that Nazi doctors who gave Jews lethal injections justified what they did. He talks about how people justified what they did by saying that they were killing people, other people healthy by killing those who were weak or ill or these kinds of things. This idea of a way that you justify something that's not appropriate. So Norway continues to produce a lot of fossil fuels, but gas is better than coal. Norwegian oil is cleaner, these kinds of discourses that justify the continual production of fossil emissions. Okay, so in closure for that sort of general argument from the book, this denial as I'm talking about it, is not psychological, not just individual, although that's relevant, but is something that's happening across what sociologists talk about the micro, the meso, and the macro parts of social order. That at the individual level, there's the micro, there's the emotions that we feel, but those emotions are coming out of social contexts of what is acceptable to feel and think and talk about, and are being shaped by them. And also in terms of the larger political economy, the fact that Norway gets a lot of wealth, as I'll give a little example from oil, or in the United States, you know, our position, people in the Maldives do not feel guilty about their emissions in the way that we do in the United States, right? This is what I'm talking about. So what I do here is make this link between, and this is one example, there's a number of charts, sort of how this works as a collective, for the sociological aspect of it, between emotions, the norms that people feel accountable to and mostly follow, and then the strategies that they have for fitting into those, for fear, for guilt, so forth, and the ways that, that this works. Also, I spent a lot of time talking, looking at conversations. How could climate change come up as a topic, and if so, how? It turns out people would talk about climate change kind of in small talk, like when they're waiting for the bus, or you greet a neighbor on the street. Oh, the climate is sure, you know, this climate change is great, or you know, oh, it's you know, it's carbon emissions that are the problem, you know, why we have this warm weather, or what have it. But they didn't really talk about it in any political context. I spent a lot of time with the local, Norway is very politically active, including at the local level, and I spent a lot of time with different groups. Climate change was not being politicized in those ways. In social settings, it was a time to relax and sort of have fun with your friends and not talk about serious things, this kind of thing. I mentioned already, this is not, in terms of the political economic context, this is not coincidence. It's important to think about how the Norwegian government, unlike the United States, is a state oil company, Statoil, so the wealth is really going into the public fund at large. It's not the kind of case where there's a few who are making a lot of profit on this. And the oil fund, which I mentioned up there. And so this shapes how people think, what people feel is shaped in that context. We can think about emotion as connected and how we think is connected in our political economic context. Two Norwegian researchers for the Norwegian government talk about Norway, an already wealthy and highly developed country, built a very significant fortune, especially starting in the 90s, from the very activity that has made the stabilization of carbon dioxide next to impossible. Okay, thank you for, I know this is a lot, especially as a sort of, I'm trying to give you a whole disciplinary background and years of work, and hopefully I'll change your minds, and I'm trying to make it as clear as possible as well. So back to these two challenges to democracy. One of them being from the climate skeptic movement, which is debating the facts. The second challenge is the one I'm talking about, this idea that the facts can actually be known, but not be enough, not matter, not generate mobilization. And this is the part where I believe that the second way that climate change really is a threat to what we think of in our democratic institution. It's a much more insidious way that power is operating. We can think about power in a more overt way, of the ability to use corporate money and political influence to change. We've had a lot of research about that. Dr. Bruhl, who's in the audience, has done a lot of important work on that. It's come out in Congress and lawsuits these days. But this is a more insidious way that power is operating. It's less overt, and yet I think it's very important. Quoting from Stephen Luke's, "Is it not the supreme and most insidious exercise of power to prevent people, to whatever degree, from having grievances by shaping their perceptions, cognitions, and preferences in such a way they accept their role in the existing order of things, either because they can see or imagine no alternative to it, or because they see it as natural and unchallengeable?" And I want to talk in a minute, as I get to the closing, about imagination as well, because I talk about that as a very wonderful concept within sociology, about the sociological imagination. And I think that a lot of what the natural science community has done very well is to invigorate our ecological imagination, our ability to understand how human impacts are affecting the climate. Okay, so my book was trying to change this discourse, sort of how I've described, from this idea that we need more facts. And again, you know, I was at the AGU in last December. There's still a lot of important emphasis on climate literacy. It's important. I hope many of you are involved in it. But climate literacy alone is not the limitation if you buy what I've been laying out for you. That we have to think more about the conditions on a real social structural level under which people will become mobilized to engage those facts in their lives. But it may not be because they don't know or don't care. I want to also emphasize, though, that in contrast to just thinking about this as sort of a psychological level, that people are somehow inherently unable because of guilt or fear or inherently able to grapple with this, but that we experience these emotions that it's a part of a larger social context. So if that's true, the next important question that I know you'll ask me, or I hope you would, every audience has so far, would be what do we do next about this? And I want to, in closing, give a few slides of my thinking on this and talk about what the present political context is in terms of the kinds of climate discourses that we have. Specifically, if denial matters, as I hope I've convinced at least some of you a little bit that it may, what would we need to do to get out of it? And I think that on the one hand, I've painted for you a more discouraging view of what our problem is. It's sort of a circular problem, in a way, of political economy, social norms, that keep people paralyzed in not mobilizing around guilt. But I also think we can look at this and say that if there are components to this system that are about the micro or individual, about the meso and about the macro, that there are actually intervention points for shifting the current situation. And I actually believe it is shifting very rapidly now, which is, I think, exciting and all the more important that we try to think about this. So when we have, as we have in Paris, this unbelievable moment of agreement, which is equally unacceptable in terms of its failure to have a binding and the amount that the nations have projected and so forth. And yet we have something we have never had before, which is this international agreement. It can be a point of leverage which can mobilize and contradict some of that hopelessness. So again, I'm thinking about these in terms of these emotions. Or similarly, right now in Oregon, we've had a lot of mobilization around getting statewide, first we worked on a carbon tax, and now it's more on a cap and trade, but statewide measures to work for reducing carbon emissions. And these can shift things. Or when we hear that ExxonMobil has known since whatever year it is, 1980, and then work to change this, to cover up, it may shift that feeling of guilt, and especially if we combine that knowledge with an understanding about the relative power of those entities versus myself not getting on an airplane, which I probably maybe shouldn't have done to come see you. But the relative role or agency of entities to change, we could maybe shift from guilt to anger, which is a different mobilizing thing for emotions. And individuals can also, on our own terms, find ways to become engaged and find meaning. So that said, our present political context isn't there yet, and I hope that all of you will help me to change this. And this, I know I want to be sure to leave good time for questions, so just the last couple minutes, I want to talk about what that present context is. We don't have a lot of focus on where to go. So a lot of people think that what they can do, or the best thing they can do about climate change is, as I've sort of said, to maybe use less energy or get more efficient light bulbs, and these things matter, but they are not on the scale that we need to create change at this time. We need more of a larger scale social focus about what it means to shift away from coal and these kinds of things, how we're going to really, at the larger level, and I know many of you are involved with this, but not all of the scientific expertise around this has gotten into the public. And as a result, people perceive it, especially in the context of social norms where they can't, they feel that they have to drive or fly or whatever it is, they can't visualize what they can do, and so they don't mobilize. Similarly, this is also changing in the last 2 years, and especially since the march in New York City and so forth. When you have a context where you look around and it doesn't look like anybody else cares either, it's a circular piece. And so that makes people feel more hopeless. Why bother? And of course, then there's a lot of discourse around different forms of engagement not being seen as socially appropriate or these kinds of things. And yeah, I think we need to think about activism in a broad way, whether it's writing letters to the newspaper, testifying before Congress, becoming involved in local politics, what have you, as well as the people who are going into the streets. What we do have in terms of the larger climate discourses today is a very sort of generic apocalyptic framing about the future, rather than talking about what is going to happen in this town, in this community, in 10 years, in 50 years, in 30 years, and how do we begin to plan for that? And what can we do? Because I think in the context of moving from this generic apocalyptic framing that's all of the rage in the sci-fi novels, which are important in their own way, or in the movies about apocalyptic futures, it does not help people feel that there's anywhere to go forward. And if you can't go forward, why bother? So I think helping to make it specific is helpful. We have the conversations about things like clean coal, which I think just, maybe we'll have a larger conversation about that. That's not useful. There's justifications in Norway for continuing oil development. We have the climate skeptic discourse, which really has interfered with, has really put a damper and set us back in terms of the kinds of conversations where instead we're having a conversation about whether climate change is happening or not. And there's been a lot of, we have a conception in the United States of us as individuals. We've had good work coming on the individual framework about how individuals can respond, but we don't have as much work about how we can respond collectively, which really at this is a collective problem. And we as humans, so society is organized in complex ways that need to take into account cultural practices. How do you shift cultural practices? How do you get more social movement mobilization? How do you help people visualize what they can do? These are not just problems that are about the kinds of things of how much we can reduce emissions by technological changes, which also have to happen. So at the same time as this is a map showing sort of where the new oil fields and who owns them as the Arctic ice recedes in the north, at the same time as we have this kind of large-scale power politics happening amongst the oil industry and the national governments in the Arctic circumpolar area. Instead, we have more of this kind of 10 ways to be more green and exercise your consumer muscle, and that's very well developed, but not how, as a public citizen, people can be involved. Yet this current discourse that's focused mostly on lifestyle change, people, I think, at some level recognize is not adequate, and so this is part of the problem, creating that sense of helplessness and powerlessness, because it's not what we need. So that's where we need to have this discourse. I want to introduce this idea of the sociological imagination from C.W. Mills, which is about the ability to see how our lives are shaped by our larger social context and how we can, in turn, given the constraints and particularities of that social context, create social change. So we need to, in the piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, I talk about this idea of an ecological imagination, which I think the natural scientists understand on a visceral level, the need to show people how their impacts are affecting, despite the fact that my carbon emissions go into this larger atmosphere with all of the atmospheric circulation, we need to be able to visualize that there is a relationship, even though I will never see it in my lifetime. What that relationship specifically is, we need to visualize that. Similarly, we need to better visualize how we are not only individuals, but part of a larger collective. So we need to have public discourse about the seriousness of climate change, which is something that I think the natural science community has been doing and is doing good work on, and this needs to continue. We need to have more of a sociological imagination about how we can each affect social change, not only in terms of like an individual carbon footprint, but as citizens in the world that we live in, which is a unique moment in our human history, and how social movements are able to mobilize in this context. Okay, so thank you. You've been very patient, and I hope you...
I'm sure that's going to generate a lot of questions.
What role do climate change deniers take in Norwegian society?
Well, it has increased. It was, at the time I was there, it was almost none. But it has increased somewhat. You know, it is a movement that's come out of the United States, mostly started in the United States and Australia, and it's spread. There's good work that's sort of done on sort of how those networks have spread. That was part of why it was so useful for me to do that original ethnographic work in Norway, is it really was not much of a landscape. So I did not talk to anyone who believed that climate change wasn't happening, or although, of course, there's not a one-to-one correlation between the lack of snow and all these things and climate change, I didn't speak to anyone who didn't believe, and people believe that this was because of climate change. So, excellent question.
Great.
So you talked about society as a whole. I'm wondering if you could also talk about the heterogeneity within the society but across people. Because I would imagine that compared with someone who's working at a state oil and another people, just a normal Norwegian citizen who benefit from the oil in a more indirect way, I would imagine the level of guilt, the level of helplessness will be really different.
Yes.
Are there ways we can better target some type of person and try to create momentum in order to change the whole society?
Thank you. That's a great question. Part of why I focused in Norway is two reasons. One, it is more homogenous, both in the sense of class equality, racially, it's not very racially diverse, and because there's a very homogenous education system. There was one television station until not that long ago. So there's more of and because of the state oil, that money is going into the public at large. So it's much different than the United States in that sense. And I think it is very, if you buy what I'm saying, that these emotions are relevant for social location, they're shaped by social location, that's exactly the question to ask. And I think that, that said, I think that to some extent, these kinds of emotions as a background thing, this background denial is relevant even in many communities. So there's work done on how climate scientists normalize their emotions around climate change. Now there's been some, I just reviewed a paper recently that maybe one of you wrote it, and now it's been outed that I was your reviewer. But you know, there's people who are thinking about it, and I think that even though there are, and you could say, well, these are the people who are in the least denial, right? And yet even they are having trouble and are doing things to keep that at a distance, to create a sense of normalcy that's not just dealing with the fear, for example. So I think that they are relevant in a background sense, and that of course they differ in different political and social contexts.
So emotions cannot be bottled up for long periods of time without defensive operations such as you described. And if people do not believe that, are not presented with alternative or candidate solutions, or do not believe that those solutions are viable, then the situation you described only gets worse. And I haven't heard in this talk any candidate solutions, except vaguely, sort of the usual combo of more growth and more humanism.
I'm not sure how you got quite that, but that's okay. Thank you for, so the question is essentially how we could move forward to break through this. And I think, well, for one thing, we are in new terrain. You know, this is the crisis that climate change reflects, the level of threat that it is to our our economic structure, our political, our meaning systems. This is not the terrain we've been in before. We can think about Hannah Arendt's concept of the sort of the new human condition after when people are working with that after the whole Holocaust crisis as sort of these moments where people are trying to grapple with what is the world that we're in today. And make parallels, and some of the people in the humanities are doing that. But so on the one hand, I don't have a recipe for you because we have not been here before. But I do think that we can look at different kinds of parallel things. So on the one hand, you're right that if people are sort of bottling these up or not expressing them, we can look at the kind of political mobilization that's happening now around Bernie Sanders, that happened around Obama, where lots of young people who hadn't been politically active because, for whatever reason, but I think that there's a reasonable comparison to be made, didn't think it was worth it. They were disillusioned with the political system. Why bother? In a similar way that I think there's a why bother around climate change. That when there is an opportunity for something, that it can shift rapidly. And so we saw a lot of grassroots mobilization, and we are seeing again now around the Sanders campaign a lot of grassroots mobilization that could be a sort of a tapping into that sense of hopelessness that's moving beyond it. I think at I think other things too, like the ways if media outlets were, the way the media talks about climate change, which has begun to shift, can have a large effect on how people make connections between things. We used to not have very few stories about how climate change is connected. It helps people understand that and see that it's connected in their own life. And that, I mean, again, that I don't think information alone can do it, but it can be ways of changing the discourse. Or if we were able to get media influence to talk more about more real political strategies. A lot of the work that people are doing in this room around the way forward, that there is somewhere forward rather than just this negative apocalypse. That I think is useful. So I think we can talk after.
Rob?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I want to sort of push you a bit and ask about if there is not another kind of denial going on here, which is that, as you rightly point out, climate change is a huge problem, and I think to try and find solutions for this within the current economic paradigm that talks about endless growth is just impossible in a sense. And here I think I want to remind of the other work by C. Wright Mills about the role of the power elite in white collar and so on and so forth, and their role in trying to tell you basically there is no alternative, in the words of Margaret Thatcher.
Sure.
Right? Unless that fundamental economic reality is questioned and engaged in sort of public discourse, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
Well, this is exactly what I'm talking about, and maybe I'm soft pedaling it a little too much because I'm not I'm not sure who the audience is or but Naomi Klein's book, around that this is really fundamentally about capitalism. I mean, I think if you talk to sociologists, all of us have a critique of how those features of social structure are holding these things in place, and so this is part of having a real discourse about what is happening and where where we need to go and how to mobilize against it. Absolutely. And maybe that's speaking to the prior question too.
How social movements can mobilize. What I've extracted from sociology over a lifetime, just much, way at the top of the list is that movements get out of control. The mobs are dangerous. Is there any way in which can you in your space of possibilities imagine movements motivated by climate change that are worse than nothing?
Well, it's an interesting question, I mean, especially in light of sort of the way that Trump is mobilizing. Thank you for this question. So so up until around the 50s and 60s, sociologists did talk about social movements in the way that you described, sort of, as sort of crowd behavior that was seen as irrational and very dangerous. But that thinking began to change in the 70s with people became more sympathetic to claims from the civil rights movement, from the environmental movement, and these were seen as legitimate And so the thinking is no longer that way. Social movements are not
combining those two kinds of things.
So social movements are no longer understood to be irrational or dangerous.
That is truly dangerous, what you just said.
Okay,
We have the 50s and 60s, we have the 70s and 80s, we have two eyes, we combine them as one inside. Then you would have both in your head.
So social movements are dangerous to the status quo, right? I mean, that's the point of them.
And to well-being, sometimes.
Particularly of minorities and disadvantaged people, and most people don't want to stand up and do something that they know is going to largely impact people who are suffering already, because they're already the ones who live in dangerous areas, toxic areas, etc. So you can, just making a big thing. Go ahead.
Another formulation, the 1930s with Trump are alive and well. They're not that far back.
So I want to do a couple things. This is a great conversation. I think, especially since 9/11, so first of all, we can think about social movements in a broad sense. We can think about the people who are doing the kayaktivists, and it sounds like at least some of us are not planning to sign up for that activity, especially in the light of 9/11, and maybe this image that I've shown is not the one that's going to be the most compelling. But we are in a time of a lot of so-called direct action and those kinds of things. But we can also think about social movements that are changing. So social movements are not just people in the streets, although they tend to have that component. But it's people writing letters, people doing all kinds of things, people teaching classes, changing their research agendas. All of these kinds of things reflect the social movement activity. Writing letters, as I said, sort of trying to change the public discourse in a wide variety of ways. We are at a time. It's true that that people who are activism is given a bad name, and people can be targeted, and more vulnerable people will be targeted in those ways. And yet, if you look at who is rising up with the indigenous movements are very active, and people are so I don't know that it's just an either or either, but I would encourage you to think about social movements. Social movements are dangerous to the status quo, but we need to change society, I believe, at this point. We need to change how we think, how we understand things.
Wait. This could go on forever. And it's fine with me if it does. I don't think anybody's coming in the room. But let me officially adjourn the seminar, and then anyone who wants to continue a conversation can either come up or sit here and have the conversation. But Kari, thank you so much.
Very busy. Oh, no problem. As long as you receive my email. Okay, great. So whenever you have time to read it, just let me know. No problem. No worries.